jump in. I'll just welcome everybody and then turn it over to Kate for some introductory remarks. Welcome everybody. I'm Belinda Griswold with Resource Media. Know many of you, some of you I don't know. Today, as you know, we're going to be talking about data-informed storytelling. So it's kind of a mashup between the amazing data people and the second-rate storytelling person. But we have all the amazing data people on the call with us. So as we get into more, we're leaving a good chunk of time at the end for Q&A. So we'll have them available from the 3 organizations that do data products for the DRWI. Welcome everyone. We'll jump in. Tanya from ANS will just give a real quick overview and then we'll head into storytelling land.
Hi, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'm going to link all of this in the chat for everybody, and all of these resources will be made available to you after the webinar via email. So one of the things that we're going to be including is this one pager that Colleen put together. Thank you, Colleen. It looks really nice. And basically it's a list of the data products and visualization tools that are available to the DRWI. So here are everything that the River Network offers, everything that the Academy of Natural Science offers, and everything that Stroud offers. Everything there is hyperlinked, so there should be fairly easy for you to go to each of these different portals. And of course, there's email addresses that you can reach out to any of us if you have questions after this webinar, for any questions that we can help answer. Okay.
Cool. And there's also, sorry, maybe you mentioned this, but there's also the previous webinar in this series is like the deep dive where, so people can listen to that. If you want to go into more detail about the products and all of that stuff, you can listen to the previous webinar.
The previous webinar I'm going to put in the chat as well as the PDFs. Thank you, Belinda, I forgot.
Yeah, totally. But no need to grab it from the chat because we'll email it to everyone and we'll also put it in Basecamp so it'll be accessible and archived there for the foreseeable, for as long as Basecamp shall live. All right, so we will, now let's jump into the storytelling side of this. And, you know, we're gonna zip through a lot of pretty dense content, and I've tried to make it relatively accessible, and most importantly, that we can have a lot of time for conversation at the end of the webinar so we can really dig in. So this will be the kind of skip through, and then we'll have time to talk. Sorry. Okay. This has been a day of technical challenges. All right. We have the obligatory storytelling fire because as everyone knows, we are creatures who are wired for storytelling. That's actually how we understand information. So I just like to remind folks of that even when we're deep in the data, we are still creatures of story. Why is this happening? Tanya mentioned this. I'll send it out again to everyone. This is an overview of the products so that you can really pick and choose and collaborate with the amazing people who are doing the data products for the data. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about why storytelling is so incredibly important. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the role of data in storytelling, get into some strategic considerations around storytelling. Then I'll give you kind of like a template elements of story, and then we'll spend some good time with 3 examples of how to use data to reach particular decision makers. So why would you use stories? Basically, do you want to connect with people? Do you want to communicate with people? Stories are the way to do that. So thinking about stories as the fundamental way that you communicate, and everything else that follows along or fits into story is by far the sort of most effective way to think about and engage with the information that you want to share through story. I want you to have the brain science, because I know since you're on this data-informed webinar, you need the brain science slide. What happens when people look at data by itself versus stories that of course can and should contain data. The amount of brain activity that occurs in human brains when there's a story to organize the information is just totally different and much, much higher, and also much more connected to decision-making and emotional centers of the brain that are actually going to get folks to do what you would like them to do. And I'm having a little trouble with my stupid Mac today because of an operating system issue, so I can't see the chat while I'm sharing my screens, but I will come back and take a pause and get to the chat in a couple of minutes. So sorry guys about that.
And I can reach out to you if I see anything important that you need to know.
Tanya, will you flag anything big?
Sure.
So data in stories, and you know, this is kind of the heart of the matter, right? How do we deploy really important, extremely relevant scientific information in the context of stories? I want to give you a couple examples of how that can be done well and less well. This is an older story. This is from 2018. It's an excellent example, and you'll get the link in the slides, because this is a story about the reader who has a question. This is the business, like corporate audience in 2018 when the climate conversation was different than it is today. And this story, it was highly interactive and really allowed the reader and the viewer to engage from the perspective of a deep question, and then engage the data from the perspective of that question. So this is a nice example of how to do that well, where the hero, the protagonist of the story, which I'll talk about later, is the reader with a deep question.
Belinda, I think there's some people in the waiting room, if you can let them in.
Awesome, thank you so much. Oh, there's John. And more folks in PDA. Okay, I let them in, thanks so much, Sonia. Oh, even more. Oh, Sandra's here. Okay, I think we got almost everyone in now. Okay. Welcome, new folks, and sorry about the delay in allowing you in. Let's just go back to this slide for a second to catch up the new folks. So all the folks who have just joined, we're just spending a little bit of time at the beginning of the webinar going through some examples of effective storytelling based on data and less effective, and sort of how we use data in storytelling in an impactful way versus when we can somewhat easily lose people. So here's the real headline, and probably if you just have to take one slide from this whole thing, this is the one. Data is not a character, right? So for those of us who deal with a lot of data on a daily basis, researchers and scientists, and even policy and advocacy people who are constantly deploying data, we tend to think that like the facts are a thing that speak for themselves. And in fact, referencing that brain slide earlier, that is just not the case. So data needs to support storytelling and arguments and emotional content. It itself cannot be a character or the lead, right? Humans with our conflicts and our stories and our challenges and our victories are always the leading character. And then data supports those people and their struggles, or those movements and their struggles. I really love this one. I just had to give you a good one. So there are incredibly powerful ways to present data to support a story. And then there are ways to just confuse the hell out of people. This is obviously a ridiculous, this is a real, by the way, this is real data. And I know no one on this call would ever use a slide like this, but it's just to give you a feel for, you know, most decision makers, aside from pretty sophisticated agency folks, are dealing with STEM at an 8th grade level, just like most Americans read at about an 8th grade level. This is what a lot of our data looks like to most readers and consumers. And so I think just regrounding in an understanding that when we present information in the context of stories, it has to be accessible to an 8th grader. The presentation needs to be that way of scientific information, and sometimes you might even need more explainers. And this goes, by the way, for really sophisticated donors, right? And certainly for elected officials, they are no different from the average lay audience in terms of their STEM comprehension and reading ability. I wanted to share this too as an example of a data product that is actually has some good things going for it, but ultimately is actually pretty damn confusing. It's not as confusing as this, right? But it is confusing because there is TMI. There is so much going on here. And this, I think, gives you a feel for the type of product that might be interesting and accessible to a very small slice of a professional, highly educated audience. And for most audiences is not actually going to be accessible in any meaningful way. And it would be difficult to support a good story and good arguments with data like this because there's so much going on here. So even though it's pretty and well designed, which is great, and it's an important piece, I just want to show you kind of what something that is going to lose people, even though it's well designed and beautiful, looks like. Okay, so now let's transition into the piece about strategy. So humans are storytellers. That's how we understand information. Data's got to support our stories. But, you know, if we craft stories with a strategic perspective, they're going to be way, way more impactful than if we don't go through this series of steps. And everyone, almost everyone that I know on this call has heard me say this, like, sorry, way too many times, but I'm going to repeat it again today because it's so fundamental and we sort of can't go wrong if we walk through these steps. It's all about knowing your audience, right? It's all about who exactly do you want to reach and how do you want them to feel and what do you want them to do once you've reached them with your story. So this set of 6 questions is really like, if you work through this at the beginning of whatever communications project you're doing, you will not go wrong because you are focused on the people that you're trying to reach instead of on your own side of the storytelling, right? Which is a really common, like in the conservation world, to be pretty focused on how we understand things and a little bit less focused on who our audience is and how they understand things and how we can connect. So this basic step of knowing your audience and identifying those folks very, very early on in whatever project you're engaging in makes everything else a lot simpler and more streamlined, and also helps you make decisions, better decisions when you are working with awesome data folks about what kind of data to craft, because you will be thinking about, you know, the statewide elected official that you know you need to reach with this, for example, and everything goes through that filter. So we'll jump quickly now through what
Belinda, there was a question asking about, can you speak to how number 2 and number 5 are different?
Yes, ooh, I like it. So number 2 is meant to get at core values, right? What is sort of like top of mind for these folks. And that differs a little bit across audiences, but for most US audiences, that is stuff like health, safety, prosperity, you know, basic kind of core values that are deeply, deeply animating people's understanding of the world and their set of decisions and desires. The frame question is definitely like worth a day-long training unto itself, and we could go deep there, but we won't right now. And the frame is about the set of narrative structures that encompass an issue. For example, for a lot of moderate to right and conservative audiences, the frame of burdensome regulations is an incredibly powerful set of narrative structures that hold any conversation about clean water protections. So say we're trying to reach moderate or conservative audiences, and we're asking that question, what kind of frame do they see the issue of clean water protections? We know it's going to be that regulations are burdensome, right? And identifying and understanding what those frames are at the outset as much as we can, right? We can't go into like, deep cognitive science for every audience, for every product. But that's what that question is getting at, is what's the sort of like surround through which people understand the particular issue. Okay, thanks for that. So now we'll go through just briefly, again, you guys are getting the super condensed so that we can really get into the examples and Q&A, but we'll spend a little time with elements of story just to give you a sense of what constitutes an effective story, right? An effective story isn't, we went out to find something about how the creek was doing and here's what we found. We'll walk through that in a little bit of detail now. Oh, you guys aren't getting that, are you? Okay, so we'll start with the fundamentals. Every story has characters, it has a conflict, and it has a setting, right? So real humans in a real place who are facing a real issue. That is like the fundamental kind of building block cornerstone of any story. Then a stronger story has some of this stuff going on as well. So there's imagery, there's struggle or setbacks, there's foreshadowing, like what might happen or what could happen, right? The suspense. There's vulnerability in terms of what the characters are dealing with and their set of constraints and limitations, and also their strengths in the midst of vulnerability. And perhaps, like, as importantly, if we're talking about icing on the cake of good stories, there's unpredictability, right? Like, a story is interesting because we don't totally know what's going to happen. And so that having that piece of like discovery, uncertainty, unpredictability can add a lot of more emotional engagement to any type of storytelling. And, don't make it up if it's not there, but think when you're thinking about how to communicate with particular decision makers and what the fundamental story is, finding places where there is some unpredictability or uncertainty is like a very magic little sparkle there that can add a certain level of much more emotional engagement with your story. I want to just talk a sec about characters. Again, we could spend like a whole day on this, but it's really kind of critical to identify characters that actually resonate with the audience part. So, right, always going back to the audience part. So let's just take this kind of general hypothetical example of trying to reach moderate and conservative audiences. For moderate and conservative audiences, an environmental NGO is not going to be a charismatic lead character, right? Somebody like a farmer or somebody from the hook and bullet crowd is going to be a more effective protagonist. So thinking about the cast of characters that is available to you and through the lens, again, of resonating with your audience. And again, like, we don't have to be contrived about this, right? This isn't like a template thing where, you got to go out and find the guy who's the perfect guy for your audience. It's more to structure your thinking about how you structure your story. And characters, particularly the hero and heroine characters and the villain characters, it's really important to work through those early on so that you don't end up accidentally with a very uncompelling story because you picked characters that don't actually resonate with your audience. And then the last thing I want to talk about a little bit is this narrative arc, right? Every story kind of has a setting, and this is a more wonky version of this, but I think it's probably helpful because it gives you the whole arc, every story has like a setting or an exposition or like welcome to this world. Then there's a challenge in which the feeling builds, right? Then there's a choice or a climax, kind of a moment of decision. And then there's resolution, falling action into resolution. So, you know, the great kind of myth stories and kind of heroine challenging the great evil empire and triumphing, you know, all these stories are like a super exact match for this arc, but you don't need to have like Star Wars, right, to have a good story. You can actually have a really good story even in a less emotionally intense kind of way if it contains these elements. I think I will pause there for 1 second because there's often questions about this actually. I'm gonna stop my share for a second so that we can talk about this for a second, because folks often have questions about this particular. Is there stuff that comes to mind or questions in particular about the narrative arc that anyone wants to dig into? Okay, cool. Yeah, feel free to chat and we'll also come back to that piece when we go through the examples. So the laying out, the challenge, the choice, and then the resolution or outcome, those core elements form every compelling story. And so now we'll get into these examples and we'll spend a little time both going through these three that I kind of put together. It's a little bit of a mashup, but then we'll open it up and really, I think, hopefully have a good like half an hour for some digging into the conversation about what these look like. Because they're, you know, these are kind of generalized examples, but everyone has some very specific ones. So we'll have plenty of time for that. Okay, so the first example is the audience is a local elected official. So it could be a city council person, it could be the mayor, you know, any level of local, whether that's like township or town or city or county, but somebody who's close to the ground and has in their entire career and identity as an elected official depends on their relationship with the local community. This is a story that used data from some rain gardens and actually used really solid, interesting data from Villanova to show that rain gardens actually work. And this is a point that might seem obvious to a lot of people who work in GSI, but actually is not necessarily super obvious to local elected officials. So this set of stories, this was like a repost on TTF's blog, and there was some good coverage about it as well, was set up to create a story where the community had put some really good sweat into building some really cool things. And were they going to work or not? And the answer is yes, they actually work, they actually clean the water. And implicit in this is you, local elected official, can be the next person at the next ribbon cutting. You can be the next hero of this version of the story, where the community comes together to do something it believes in, and then there's evidence and science and powerful data to show that it's actually working to accomplish the community's aims. And that is a reputation burnishing and connecting set of narratives for the local elected official. So
Belinda, sorry,
yeah.
We have one question. Can you define falling action?
Oh yeah, okay. And yeah, falling action basically means the set of resolution-y events that happen after the hero or the heroine has made their choice or has faced the challenge head on. So it can look very different in all different kinds of stories, but it's basically that set of events that's set in motion towards the resolution. And we call it falling action because it's kind of cascading down to what we call the outcome or the resolution. So like, let's just give a super simple example of, you know, St. George faces the dragon and steps into the cave with the sword, and the fight and the back and forth, and that's the falling action. And then when he finally kills the dragon, that's the resolution, right? So that's a kind of a, you know, really basic example, but we see that in every story where it's like, we set out to face this challenge, we faced it, and then the series of events happened, and that led us to the resolution. Does that make sense, Suzanne? Okay, I'm gonna take that as yes. In this story, with this kind of background story here about, we installed rain gardens and we tested them, and then the results came back and they were actually strikingly, amazingly effective. The falling action in this story is actually connected to the researchers and their part of the story, where they're looking at the water and measuring it and coming out to the gardens and being like, oh my gosh, there's so much less sediment and nitrate. And then we get to the point where the community calls this a success, yay. So in this story, the falling action is actually connected to the scientific kind of process and the set of relationships between the researchers and the community. So our second example is story maps. And here we're talking about, story maps are great for all kinds of reasons, and you can use them, oh, David got kicked out. You can use them for all kinds of audiences, but I wanted to highlight them for reaching donors for a couple of reasons. And we're talking individual donors here, but for sure these are relevant and very, very useful to foundations who often like to see snazzy presentations of data in you know, in wrap-up reports and in proposal for the next couple of years of work. Story maps are great because they can look really, really beautiful, and that's very important, obviously, as everyone knows, especially for reaching individual donors. But they can be as data heavy or as data thin as you want them to be, depending on the audience. And there's a lot of amazing skills in the DRWI about kind of appropriately scaling story maps. And I wanted to use this one. This is from the West, this Madison watershed example. And I'm not going to load the full thing for you all because it's actually very data heavy, but you'll get it in the slides. This is a great example of kind of a sandwiching of something really gorgeous with enough meat on the bones to really be compelling. And in this case, as in a lot of cases with story maps, the hero or the heroine of the story, again, is a local clean water leader. It could be an organization, but it's usually better if it's not, but that's certainly possible. It's usually better to have an organization be a supporting character. There's a beloved place, in this case, the Madison River, and there's the threat is of actually losing this incredibly beloved place. And the story, the underlying story is about the years of work, understanding the level of the challenge and actually the factors contributing to water pollution, and then working together with the local community to address it. The falling action here is, in this case, it's the last couple of years of work bringing together people around, in this case, a lot of it was land preservation and ag BMPs to get to a place where the river was cleaner. And the resolution is this celebratory moment. And this is brought to the donor to say, help us keep going, right? You know, this isn't completely sewn up, but we're looking at heading towards a resolution, and with your support, we actually get there.
So someone just put in the chat, so the following action, oh, bless you.
Bless you.
So the following action is the momentum that the climax achieves that propels the story to its conclusion. A logical and or emotional cause and effect?
Yeah, nice, Elliot. That's a good way of putting it. The only thing I would add is it's more following action and that kind of series of events toward resolution is more emotional and logical. That set of events is propelled by the logic of whatever happened in the kind of climax or choice point. But it is the part of the story when those of us reading or listening to the story feel like, oh, are they gonna, can they make it? Can they meet the challenge? You know, it is the point in the story where there's more unpredictability and more emotional charge. So as between logical and or emotional, I would go a little bit more on the emotional side in following action. And actually that is relevant to an example like this, because when we're trying to reach donors, obviously we can't go to a donor and be like, we solved the problem, now keep funding us, right? That doesn't tend to work very well. But we do need to show them that a resolution is within sight, and we are in this process of solving this set of problems in an inspiring way, and we need them to help us do that. So there's a little bit of a balance there, especially more so with individual donors, but with foundations as well, where we want to show enough progress, and we've passed the climax part of the story usually, but we're not all the way at the end, because obviously they're not necessary and essential to us if we've already reached the resolution. So story maps can be great for that. Story maps can be great for many things, but the best use of them I've seen have been a little bit more funder facing. And then the last audience I wanted to talk about is statewide agency folk in general. Obviously, this is a pretty diverse crowd, and it depends a lot on your state and what the regulatory apparatus is in your state. But I wanted to use a report card example for this audience in two possible scenarios. So one scenario is we've been busting butt for years, and they are obstructing us, and they are in the way, and we really have a problem. It's catalyzing these folks to act in a more expeditious, effective way. So that's example one. And in that case, we would use a report card to bring pressure. The great thing about report cards is they distill technical data into something that every 8th grader gets, right? What was the grade? And this is a nice example because you see that we have these 3 typologies or categories: fisheries, habitat, and pollution. And then visually what's highlighted is the fact that we're at a D+, which is clearly not good. So in a story in which we're actually positioning the statewide agency folks as the villain, not to put too fine a point on it, and we're bringing pressure by condensing the data into something that is extremely succinct and understandable. And that is used to, if we're talking about the spank and thank dichotomy of messaging, this is the spank category. Like, it's not good enough and it needs to be better, and you guys need to do better. So that's the first set of the constellation in which you might want to bring pressure on statewide agency folks. The second example, which this,
sorry.
Yeah.
There's someone, Kathleen says, what is the source of the health index? The
health index in this report card?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, it's the overall, that's the consolidation of all the data, right? Is the health of the bay, is pollution, habitat, and fisheries measurements all combined. Makes sense, Kathleen? It's an aggregation. And we get the D+ because that's an aggregation of all of these data points. that's one way to use this, right? I wanted to give you two versions of these because we really do, you know, many of you I know are trying to reach statewide agency folks in a lot of different ways. So I wanted to give you kind of the spank version and the thank version. The thank version is the community and or the state and the organizations have been working hard for a long time to improve things. And oh my gosh, we've made so much progress. And a report card is a way to communicate progress that again is highly accessible. It's accessible to media, it's accessible to local community groups, it's accessible to non-technical folk. And so you can use this kind of data to really support and thank and shine some love on statewide agency folk and decision makers of different kinds to really encourage them to keep it up. In that story where we are making those agency folks more the heroes of the story or the supporting characters who support the heroes who are in the community, it's a very different, and it's worth kind of spending some nuanced time as you develop the product thinking about what's going to be most effectively congratulatory to those kind of folks when you're thanking them, right? We want to craft the information in a way that encourages them to do more of the good stuff that they've been doing. These situations are always highly nuanced, obviously, as everyone knows. And almost always the agencies are doing some great stuff and some terrible stuff or some combination therein. And so when we're creating a story that is about showing progress and celebration and thank you to everyone who's been part of this, we want to be really thoughtful about how we present the data that that basically shows them, A, thank you so much and you've done great, and here are the particular things in which, the particular dimensions or ways in which we want you to continue. Yeah, so just a quick reminder of what's available in terms of the products. Again, that'll be sent out to everyone. And I think for our conversation time, I'm going to go back to the elements of story just as a place to hang out while we talk. So just take one more look at that and then we'll all come onto video and I can certainly share more, and David and Colleen and Tanya and everyone else who's on the call can answer questions as well. Okay, hi everybody. Oh yay, good. We have 20 whole minutes. That was my goal. So what, how does that strike everyone and what are the questions? And in particular, I'm curious if you have decision makers who are outside or audience targets who are outside these three categories of local elected officials, donors, whether individual or foundations, and statewide agency folks. And we could talk through some other examples if people want to bring them. Oh, how do you make the data friendly? Kathleen, that was a follow-up question to your health index question. I'm back in the chat now. So there's two really important ways to make the data friendly. One is using accessible non-jargony language as a descriptor, right? So like, what exactly are you measuring? There's ways to talk about what we're measuring in ways that are more accessible and less jargony. And there's ways to talk about what we're measuring in much more jargony ways. The sort of first threshold thing about making the data friendly is like, do people even know what the hell you're talking about measuring, right? And if we use really technical terminology for what we're measuring, we've lost them before we even get to the measurement side, right? The second piece of making the data friendly is really about, does the measurement mean something, right? a lot of times what we struggle with in the super powerful technical data is people have no idea what the units of measurement are and what they even mean in the context of a healthy stream or not. So that's one reason that report cards are awesome, right? Because they give you, they take the technical measurement and they translate it into another unit of measurement that everybody understands, a grade, right? So those two things, like I think if you focus on those two dimensions of being clear about what you're measuring in a way that people can understand and being clear about your unit of measurement in a way that matters, then you're good. Can the general public be an audience? Residents of the watershed, asks Kim. No, the general public can never be an audience. Never. Okay. Why is that? Because the general public is too diverse and you cannot identify shared values across the general public audience. So an audience, but there could be many, and there are many audiences within the general public. For example, are we talking about parents who have kids in the school where the rain garden is installed? Are we talking about residents of the watershed in your question who actually like to fish and hike and paddle along the creek? So we always have to drill down a little bit into the actual interests and practices of the people in the audience. Otherwise, in the interest of reaching everyone, we reach no one. And that's a bummer and a waste of time. Whereas if we spend a little more time drilling down into what the actual cares, values, and priorities are of the segments in the audience, then we're going to be able to reach them way more effectively. And we're not worried about everybody else there who we're not going to reach with this particular set of communications, and that's fine. Does that make sense? And Krista was asking about presentations to the public. Same deal, right? There's no, general public is such an incredibly high level of abstraction. If we're talking about people in a particular watershed who care enough about the river to come to a presentation, then we should think about those folks and what they actually care about. And chances are, for all of these amazing groups here, we're going to know at least some about what they care about. One little asterisk there that I just want to mention is like opposition audiences in public hearings and public presentations and stuff like that. There's no such thing as a general public audience. We should always think about who we want to reach, but we should also be attuned to like the naysayers and the, there's a very wide range of opposition audiences who can show up in any type of public presentation. So it's probably worth thinking about who those people might be and if they are going to show up, particularly at public events, how our messaging might address them. Yeah. Again, happy to talk through like the opposition and what's called inoculation messaging anytime with anyone. Just ping me. That's a whole other topic unto itself, but something to think about and talk about, and we're always here to do that if you want.
Linda, can I add something to that question?
Yeah, please, please.
Yeah, so I'm trying to create a website to present our data to the public. So that was kind of my part of the question is presenting to the public. You don't know necessarily who's looking at that data. So how, it's not necessarily tailored to one set. I mean, yes, the people that are coming to look at that are already interested, right? Yeah. So they, you know that they maybe have a little bit of background, but not a lot. So it's like, how do you disseminate that?
What do you want them to do? Like who?
Want to build understanding and constituency in the watershed that's coming to our website to look at this data.
Do you want them to eventually support stronger policies? Do you want them to give you money? Do you want them to, what do you want them to do?
All of the above, yeah.
Okay, so the key there is ranking those things that you actually want them to do. Like, is the most important thing that they give you money, or is the most important thing that they support new protections, or is the most important thing, right?
Okay,
ranking
I see what you're saying,
those
for
things
sure, okay.
Do in the real world, right?
Right.
In the actual world, not in the website viewing world. And then you craft the data to serve those purposes, right?
Yes.
Ideally,
okay.
more than 5. more than 5 is too many when we're talking about something like this. So I would go with 5 or less in terms of your prioritization of what you want them to do in the real world.
Okay.
Thank you for clarifying. That's super helpful. Yeah. Elliot, with municipal officials, Lester County, peer pressure has worked for us. Oh yeah. Showing how other more comparable municipalities are doing the right thing. Does that have a place in successful storytelling? Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That is such an awesome example, Elliot. And yes, humans, in addition to being storytelling creatures, are social creatures, right? We're co-regulating mammals with nervous systems that are only thrive when we are part of a group that is functioning. So that creating stories where there's really cool kids doing really cool stuff and you can do that too, that's really effective. Also creating stories where there's leaders and laggards, right? There's amazing leaders out there doing stuff that their community just loves them for. And what the hell? Why are you not doing that, right? Implicitly, right? We don't usually use those words, but when you think about a narrative structure, that's also an effective one. There's pressure, there's various degrees of polite and less polite pressure to join with the leaders or to emulate them. Thanks for bringing that up. Do people have examples of that where they did like more the peer pressure thing with local decision makers? Other examples? I'm curious. Oh, okay. Oh, Nancy, stories about how people that don't agree with us change. Yes, the convert story. Those can be so powerful. The key though is to have the convert, for lack of a better term, sorry to be religious about it, but it is useful, to have the convert speaking in their own words, because they will not reach their community if we are speaking for them, right? So say, we see this so much with farmers in a lot of our work. A farmer tries out some new ag BMPs and they're just like totally converted and they become an evangelizer for whatever it is, cover crops or something. If we try to tell their story about how, look how farmer Josephine totally changed her mind, that's good for our donors. It can be good for our internal audiences for sure, but it's not super effective for their community. So the key is allowing them to tell their story and be like, I saw the light and it mattered to me. And here's why it mattered to me in terms of my values, not in terms of our values, which may not be shared. Does that make sense, Nancy? Like that, letting them own the story. It's connected to ethical storytelling too. Or maybe we don't understand them. Yeah. Right. There's worlds within worlds, and folks might get on board with really amazing sets of actions and practices that we love for reasons that we do not understand or do not resonate with. And that's okay. That's fine. And the data can be used, again, as kind of like a supportive, bolstering set of evidence for their decisions, right? So in the case of farmers who do, and you know, farmers are under, as everyone knows, farmers are under so much social pressure to do the same ag practices that their neighbors do. It's really a thing, and there's a lot of tension in a lot of farming communities about doing things differently and stuff like that. So when a farmer bucks their community's set of practices and does something new, data and evidence is really very helpful and very important, both for them and for their community at large, particularly if we're talking about data related to yields, less data related to water quality. That's more how we would care about it, right? But other farmers would care about it in terms of yields. Which actually goes back to that question of how do we make data friendly? It's got to be friendly to the audience. So if we're trying to persuade more farmers, we should not necessarily present a lot of data on water quality. We should present data on yields, right?
4 days.
Yeah. What else? What other thoughts and questions people have?
one of the things that's really great, this is Faith from Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and I'm sorry I'm under the weather, but this is fabulous. I wish I was taking notes. But one of the things that we've tried to use a little bit, and I think, you know, it kind of depends, but it goes with your stories, is the idea of people's hearings on different issues, right? So pipeline is an example of that, where, you know, you have so many people coming to tell the story, and I might tell a story that's very different from the, you know, the guy from Georgia who's telling the story about eminent domain versus climate change. And the idea of using people's hearings in a way to get a collective or stories of firsthand people who are impacted, to share that with decision makers. I don't know if you have any ideas or speak how it works, hasn't worked.
I think those can be super effective. And just to zoom out for a second from the storytelling perspective, what we do when we create those kind of situations is we create a collective hero. The more diverse, the better, right? If it's strange bedfellows, much better. And then the villain, like in those types of examples, is obviously the company. And that then the kind of rising action of very diverse community members coming together to fight the dragon, despite their differences, right? And putting aside their differences, that is a really powerful part of a story. And so they can work super duper well. The only kind of caveat or thing to think about is the fundamental question, who's the audience, right? If the audience is, say, like, you know, FERC regulators or something who are just like totally insulated from community pressure and don't respond to any of that at all, then we can do as much amazing community-based heroine storytelling as we want. And those guys are not impacted, right? Because that's not their constituency and that's not what actually brings pressure on them. So if we're gonna, and you know, people's hearings and that stuff are very energy intensive, very time consuming, and, you know, a great organizing tactic on their own. But thinking of through who the audience is and how we bring pressure on those particular audiences is really important before we make such huge investments of time and energy. So for example, say we're talking about regulators, and you know, what is super influential to them are like trade press, right? And peers in the regulatory spaces. You know, a people's hearing isn't gonna necessarily reach those type of outlets or those type of spaces. So it's all about right sizing the tactic to the audience. And last thing on that with regard to the data point as well, is like in a people's hearing example where we're bringing together really diverse community members, data can be used in a really compelling way to say this same piece of data affects us differently, but it affects us all terribly, right? A different impact, but it's all stemming from the same set of metrics, and that can be super powerful. So, you know, thinking about how we bring in data when we're doing diverse heroine storytelling, I think also requires a lot more thought. Kathleen, is there a way that influence FERC regulators? That's like the question of an entire program at Resource Media right now. It does seem like it, and it seems like it is by playing exclusively in those spaces. So we can have a separate conversation about that because that's something we're doing in a lot of spaces. And I think the answer is yes, and it depends a lot on the place and constellation of the particular issue. Yeah. I want to, since we have the like awesome data people on the call, I want to particularly just put it out there if people have questions for ANS Stroud and American Rivers. I'm sorry, River Network. I'm saying American Rivers because that we're in a big FERC fight working with them with River Network. So if there are questions for the folks from the data producing organizations, this would probably be a good time because we just have a couple minutes left. And also, of course, you can email and we have all these products for you to use, but any examples or things you guys want to share from ANS Stroud or River Network? Cool. Okay. Well, may you enjoy your 3 minutes. And as Tanya said at the beginning, the folks from the data products organizations are totally available. We'll send you all this stuff as a roundup. And if you have any questions at all about deployment and crafting stories, then you can always reach out to me or Adam. We're available on call whenever you need us. So just ping us anytime. Elliot wants to follow up on influencing FERC. Yes, we should have a FERC. We should have a FERC campaigns DRWI webinar because there's a lot of knowledge sharing there from all over the country for sure. Cool. Okay, good to see everyone. Please be in touch and we'll send out all the follow-up materials and house it on Basecamp as well. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Take good care.